unreeled. Vintage recordings of fiction recovered from discontinued physical media.
The Little Mermaid. Far out in the wide sea, where the water is blue as the loveliest cornflower and clear as the purest crystal, dwell the Mer people. Now you mustn't imagine that there's nothing but sand below the water. Far from it. Trees and plants of wonderful beauty grow there, whose stems and leaves are so light that they are waved to and fro by the slightest movement of the water. Fishes glide in and out among the branches, just as birds fly about among our trees. Where the water is deepest stands the palace of the Mer King. The walls of this palace are of coral, and the high pointed windows are of amber. The roof is made of mussel shells, which, as the waves pass over them, are continually opening and shutting. This looks very pretty, especially as each of these mussel shells contains a bright, glittering pearl. The Mer King had been for years a widower. His old mother managed the household affairs for him. She was, on the whole, a sensible sort of lady, although extremely proud of her high birth and station, on which account she wore 12 oysters on her tail, while the other inhabitants of the sea were allowed only 6. In every other respect she merited unlimited praise, especially for the affection she showed to the 6 little princesses, her granddaughters. These were all very beautiful children. The youngest, however, was the loveliest. Her skin was as soft and delicate as a rose leaf. Her eyes were of as deep a blue as the sea. But like all other mermaids, she had no feet, and her body ended in a tail, like that of a fish. The whole day long the children used to play in the big rooms of the palace, where beautiful flowers grew out of the walls. When the great amber windows were opened, fishes would swim straight up to the little princesses, eat from their hands, and allow themselves to be stroked. The youngest princess was very quiet and thoughtful. While her sisters were adorning themselves with all sorts of gay things that came out of a ship which had been wrecked, she asked for nothing but a beautiful white marble statue of a boy, which had been found in it. Nothing pleased the little princess more than to hear about the world of human beings living above the sea. She made her old grandmother tell her everything she knew about ships, towns, men, and animals. "When you've reached your 15th year," said the grandmother, "you'll be allowed to rise to the surface of the sea. You will then sit by moonlight in the clefts of the rocks, see the ships sail by, and learn to distinguish towns and men." Many a night she stood by the open window, looking up through the clear blue water, while the fishes were leaping and playing around her. She could see the sun and the moon. Their light was pale, but they appeared larger than they do to those who live in the upper world. If a shadow passed over them, she knew it must be either a whale or a ship sailing by full of human beings, who, indeed, hardly thought that far beneath them a little mermaiden was passionately stretching forth her white hands towards their ship's keel. The day had now arrived when the eldest princess had reached her 15th year, and was therefore allowed to rise up to the surface of the sea. When she returned, she had 1,000 things to tell. Her chief pleasure had been to sit upon a sandbank in the moonlight, looking at the large town which lay on the coast, where lights were beaming like stars, and where music was playing. She had heard the distant noise of men and carriages. She had seen the high church towers, had listened to the ringing of the bells. Next year, the second sister received permission to swim wherever she pleased. She rose to the surface of the sea just when the sun was setting, and this sight so delighted her that she declared it to be more beautiful than anything else she'd seen above the waters. "The whole sky seemed tinged with gold," she said, "and I can't describe to you the beauty of the clouds, now red, now violet, as they glided over me." It was now time for the third sister to visit the upper world. She was the boldest of the six, and ventured up a river. On its shore she saw green hills covered with woods, and she heard birds singing. In a little bay she met with a number of children who were bathing and jumping about. She would have joined in their play, but the children fled back to the land in terror, and a little black animal barked at her in such a manner that she was frightened and swam back to the sea. She could not, however, forget the green woods and the hills and the pretty children. The fourth sister was not so bold. She remained in the open sea and said she thought nothing could be more beautiful. She had seen ships sailing by, so far off that they looked like seagulls. She had watched the dolphins gambling in the water, and the enormous whales sending up into the air 1,000 sparkling fountains. The year after, the fifth sister reached her 15th year. Her birthday happened at a different season from that of her sisters. It was winter, and immense icebergs were floating on the surface of the sea. These, she said, looked like pearls. She sat down upon one of these pearls and let the wind play with her long hair. But then all the ships hoisted their sails in terror and escaped as quickly as possible. Many an evening the 5 sisters would rise hand in hand from the depth of the ocean. Their voices were far sweeter than any human voice, and when the storm was coming on they would swim in front of the ships and sing, describing the happiness of those who lived at the bottom of the sea, and entreating the sailors not to be afraid, but to come down to them. The sailors, however, didn't understand their words. They thought the song was only the whistling of the wind. For if their ships were wrecked, everyone on board would be drowned, and none but dead men ever entered the Mer-King's palace. While the sisters were swimming at evening time, the youngest would remain in her father's palace, looking up after them. "Oh, if I were but 15, she sighed. "I know I should love the upper world and its inhabitants so much." At last the time arrived. "Well, now it is your turn," said her grandmother. "Come here that I may dress you like your sisters." And she wound round her hair a wreath of white lilies, whose every petal was the half of a pearl, and then commanded 8 large oysters to fasten themselves to the princess's tail, in token of her high rank. "But that is so very uncomfortable," said the little princess. "One mustn't mind slight inconvenience when one wishes to look well," said the old lady. When she appeared on the surface of the water, the sun had just sunk below the horizon. A large ship lay on the still waters. Music and song resounded from the deck, and after it grew dark, hundreds of lamps burst forth into light. The little mermaid swam close up to the captain's cabin, and every now and then, when the ship was raised by the motion of the water, she could look through the clear window panes. She saw many richly dressed men inside. The handsomest among them was a young prince, with large black eyes. He could certainly not be more than 16 years old, and it was in honor of his birthday that a grand party was being given. The crew were dancing on the deck, and when the young prince appeared among them, 100 rockets were sent up into the air, turning night into day. It was so light in the ship that everything could be seen distinctly. Oh, how happy the young prince was! He shook hands with the sailors, laughed and jested with them, while sweet notes of music mingled with the silence of night. It was now late, but the little mermaid couldn't tear herself away from the ship and the handsome young prince. She stayed, looking through the cabin window, rocked to and fro by the waves. There was a foaming in the depths, and the ship began to move on faster. The waves rose high, thick clouds gathered over the sky, and the noise of distant thunder was heard. The sailors saw that a storm was coming on, so they furled the sails. The great vessel was tossed about on the stormy ocean like a light board, and the waves rose to an immense height. To the little mermaid, this seemed most delightful, but the ship's crew thought very differently. The vessel cracked under the violence of the waves, the water rushed in. For a minute the ship tottered to and fro, then the mainmast broke, as if it had been a reed. The ship turned over and was filled with water. The little mermaid now saw that the crew was in danger, and her eyes sought the young prince. There was a dreadful flash of lightning, and the ship sank to the bottom. At first she was delighted, thinking that the prince must now come to her home. But she soon remembered that man cannot live in water, and if the prince ever entered her palace, it would be as a corpse. Die? No, he must not die. She swam through the wreckage and at last found the prince, all but exhausted and only just keeping his head above water. He'd already closed his eyes, and must surely have been drowned, had not the little mermaid come to his rescue. She seized hold of him and kept him above water, and the current bore them on together. Towards morning the storm was hushed. No trace, however, remained of the ship. The sun rose like fire out of the sea, and its beams seemed to restore colour to the prince's cheeks. But his eyes were still closed. The mermaid kissed his forehead and stroked his wet hair away from his face. He looked like her marble statue, and she kissed him again, wishing most fervently that he might recover. She now saw the dry land, with its mountains glittering with snow. A green wood extended along the coast, and at the entrance to the wood stood a convent. Lemon trees grew in the garden next to it, and an avenue of tall palm trees led up to the door. The sea here formed a little bay, in which the water was quite smooth, and under the cliffs there were dry, firm sands. There swam the little mermaid with the prince, seemingly dead. She laid him upon the warm sand, and took care to place his head high, and turn his face to the sun. Bells began to ring in the convent, and a number of young girls came out to walk in the garden. The mermaid hid herself behind some stones, and covered her head with foam, so that her little face could not be seen, and watched the prince. Soon one of the young girls came up. She was frightened at finding the prince in this state, apparently dead, and ran back to call her sisters. The little mermaid saw that the prince revived, and that all round smiled at him. But he didn't look for her. He didn't know that it was she who had saved him. And when the prince was taken into the convent, she felt so sad that she immediately plunged beneath the water and returned to her father's palace. If she'd been quiet and thoughtful before, she now grew still more so. Her sisters asked her what she'd seen in the upper world, but she made no answer. Many evenings she rose to the place where she had left the prince. She saw the snow melt on the mountains, the fruit ripen in the garden. But she never saw the prince, so she always returned sorrowfully to her home in the deep. Her only pleasure was to sit gazing on the beautiful statue, so like the prince. At last, being unable to hide her sorrow any longer, she told the secret to one of her sisters, who told it to the other princesses, and they to some of their friends. Among them was a young mermaid who remembered the prince, having also seen his birthday party on the ship. She knew in what country he lived, and the name of the king. "Come, little sister," said the princesses, and embracing her, they rose together, arm in arm, out of the water, just in front of the prince's palace. This palace was built of bright yellow stones. A flight of white marble steps led from it down to the sea. Through the clear glass of the high windows they could see grand apartments with silken curtains, the walls hung with magnificent paintings. The little mermaid now knew where her beloved prince lived, and she went there almost every evening. On bright moonlight nights she would watch the young prince, who thought himself alone. Sometimes she saw him sailing on the water in a gaily painted boat with many-coloured flags waving above. She would then hide among the green reeds, listening to his voice, and if anyone in the boat heard the rustling of her long silver veil, which was caught now and then by the light breeze, they only thought it was a swan flapping his wings. Many nights, when the fishermen were casting their nets, she heard them talking of the prince and telling the noble deeds he'd done. She was then so happy, thinking how she had saved his life when he was struggling with the waves, and remembering how his head had rested on her bosom, and how she'd kissed him when he knew nothing of it. Human beings became more and more dear to her every day, and she wished that she were one of them. She went to her grandmother, who knew a great deal about the upper world. "Do men, when they're not drowned, live forever?" she asked. "Do they not die as we do who live at the bottom of the sea?" "Yes," was the grandmother's reply. "They must die like us, and their life is much shorter than ours. We live to the age of 300 years, but when we die, we become foam on the sea, and are not allowed even to share a grave among those that are dear to us. We have no immortal souls. We can never live again. But human beings have souls that continue to live when their bodies become dust, and they ascend to glorious, unknown dwellings in the skies, which we are not allowed to see." "Why have we no souls?" asked the little mermaid. "I would willingly give up my 300 years to be a human being for only one day, to become entitled to that heavenly world above." "You must not think of that," answered her grandmother. "It is much better as it is. We live longer and are far happier than human beings." "So I must die, and be dashed like foam over the sea, never to rise again and hear the gentle murmur of the ocean, never again see the beautiful flowers and the bright sun? Tell me, dear grandmother, are there no means by which I may win an immortal soul?" "No," replied the old lady. "It is true that if you could so win the affections of a human being, if he loved you with all his heart, and promised, whilst the priest joined his hands with yours, to be always faithful to you, then his soul would flow into yours, and you would then become part of the human world. But that can never be, for what in our eyes is the most beautiful part of our body, the tail, the people of the earth think hideous. To appear handsome to them, the body must have two clumsy props, which they call legs. The little mermaid sighed and looked mournfully at the scaly part of her body. That evening, the little princess's grandmother gave a court ball, far more splendid than any that earth has ever seen. The walls of the palace were of crystal, very thick but very clear. Hundreds of large mussel shells were planted along them in rows. Some of these shells were rose-coloured, some green as grass, but all sent forth a bright light which shone through the glassy walls so as to light up the waters around, and made the scales of the fishes, great and small, crimson and purple, silver and gold-coloured, appear more brilliant than ever. Through the centre of the palace flowed a clear, bright stream, on the surface of which danced mermen and mermaids to the melody of their own sweet voices. The little princess sang more harmoniously than anyone, and they clapped their hands and applauded her. She was pleased at this, for she knew that there was neither on earth nor in the sea a more beautiful voice than hers. But her thoughts soon returned to the world above her. She couldn't forget the handsome prince, nor her sorrow at not having an immortal soul. While my sisters are still dancing in the palace, I will go to the enchantress, who I fear so much, but who is the only person who can help me. So the little mermaid went to the foaming whirlpool beyond which dwelt the enchantress. She had never been this way before. Neither flowers nor sea grass bloomed along her path. She had to cross an expanse of bare grey sand until she reached the whirlpool, whose waters were eddying and whizzing like mill wheels, tearing everything they could seize along with them into the abyss below. She had to make her way through this horrible place in order to arrive at the home of the enchantress. Then she had to pass through a boiling, slimy bog, which the enchantress called her turf moor. Huge, fat snails were crawling about, and in the middle of this place stood a house built of the bones of unfortunate people who had been shipwrecked. Here sat the enchantress, caressing a toad in the same manner as some people would caress a cat. The ugly fat snails she called her chickens, and she let them crawl about her. "I know well what you would ask of me," said she to the little princess. "Your wish is foolish enough, but it shall be fulfilled, though its accomplishment is sure to bring misfortune on you, my fairest princess. You wish to get rid of your tail, and to have instead two stilts like those of human beings, in order that a young prince may fall in love with you, and that you may obtain an immortal soul. Is it not so?" While the witch spoke these words, she laughed so violently that her pet toad and snails fell from her lap. "I will prepare for you a drink with which you must swim to land. You must sit down upon the shore and swallow it, and then your tail will fall and shrink up to the things which men call legs. This transformation will, however, be very painful. You will feel as though a sharp knife passed through your body. All who look on you after you have been thus changed will say that you are the loveliest child of earth they have ever seen. You will keep your graceful movements, and no dancer will move so lightly, but every step you take will cause you pain, all but unbearable. It will seem to you as if you were walking on the sharp edges of swords, and your blood will flow. Can you endure all this suffering? If so, I will grant your request.
Yes, I can, answered the princess with a faltering voice, for she remembered her dear prince and the immortal soul which her suffering might win.
Only consider, said the witch, that you can never again become a mermaid when once you have received a human form. You may never return to your sisters and your father's palace, and unless you shall win the prince's love and the priest join your hands so that you become man and wife, you will never obtain the immortality you seek. The day after he is united to another will see your death. Your heart will break with sorrow, and you will be changed to foam on the sea.
Still I will venture, said the little mermaid, pale and trembling as a dying person.
Besides all this, I must be paid, and it is no slight thing that I require for my trouble. You have the sweetest voice of all the dwellers in the sea, and you think by its means to charm the prince. This voice, however, I demand in exchange for my magic drink.
But if you take my voice from me, said the princess, what have I left with which to charm the prince?
Your graceful form, replied the witch, and speaking eyes. With such as these, it will be easy to infatuate a vain human heart. Well, now, have you lost courage? Put out your little tongue that I may cut it off and take it for myself in return for my magic drink.
Be it so, said the princess, and the witch took up the cauldron in order to mix her potion. The smoke from the mixture assumed horrible forms, and a moaning and groaning came from it which was like the weeping of crocodiles. The magic drink at last became clear and transparent as pure water. It was ready.
Here it is, said the witch to the princess, cutting out her tongue at the same moment.
The poor little mermaid was now dumb. She could neither sing nor speak.
If the branches of my trees attempt to seize you as you pass through my little grove, said the witch, you have only to sprinkle some of this magic drink over them, and their arms will burst into 1,000 pieces.
But the princess had no need of this advice,
for the branches drew quickly back as soon as they saw the bright phial that glittered in her hand like a star. Thus she passed safely through the formidable wood and across the foaming mill-stream. The princess took the bright phial, and it glittered in her hand like a star. She went back and looked once again at her father's palace. The lamps were all out, and the family were asleep. She would not go in, for she could not speak if she did. She was about to leave her home forever. Her heart was ready to break with sorrow at the thought. She kissed her hand again and again, and then rose through the dark blue waters to the world above. The sun had not yet risen when she arrived at the prince's palace and went up those well-known marble steps, and the moon still shone in the sky. The little mermaid drank the magic potion. She felt it run through her like a sharp knife, and she fell down in a swoon. When the sun rose, she awoke, and felt a burning pain in all her limbs. But she saw standing close to her the object of her love, the handsome young prince. His coal-black eyes were fixed inquiringly upon her. Full of shame, she cast down her own, and saw, instead of the long fish-like tail, 2 slender legs. But she was quite naked, and tried in vain to cover herself with her long, thick hair. The prince asked who she was, and how she had got there, and she, in reply, smiled and gazed upon him with her bright blue eyes. For, alas, she could not speak. He then led her by the hand into the palace. She found that the witch had told her the truth. She felt as though she were walking on the edges of sharp swords, but she bore the pain willingly. On she passed, and all who saw her wondered at her light, graceful movements. When she entered the palace, rich clothes of muslin and silk were brought to her. She was lovelier than all who dwelt there, but she could neither speak nor sing. "Alas," she thought, "if he did but know that for his sake I have given away my voice forever." The slaves began to dance. The lovely little mermaiden then arose, stretched out her delicate white arms, and moved gracefully about the room. Every motion displayed more and more the perfect symmetry and elegance of her form, and the expression which shone in her eyes touched the hearts of the spectators. All present were enchanted, but especially the young prince, who called her his dear little foundling, and she danced again and again, although every step cost her pain. The prince then said she should always be with him, and accordingly a bed was prepared for her on velvet cushions in the ante-room of his own apartment. The prince had a suit made for her, in order that she might accompany him in his rides. So together they went through the fragrant woods, where green boughs brushed against their shoulders, and the birds sang merrily among the fresh leaves. With him she climbed up steep mountains, and although her tender feet bled, so as to be remarked by the attendants, she only smiled, and followed her dear prince to the heights, where they could see the clouds chasing each other beneath them. During the night she would, when all in the palace were asleep, walk down the marble steps in order to cool her feet in the deep waters. She would then think of those beloved ones who dwelt in the lower world. One night, as she was bathing her feet, her sisters swam together to the spot, arm in arm and singing, but so sadly. She beckoned to them, and they immediately recognized her, and told her how great was the mourning in her father's house for her loss. From this time the sisters visited her every night, and once they brought with them the old grandmother, who had not seen the upper world for a great many years. They also brought their father, the Mer-King, with his crown on his head. But these two old people didn't venture near enough to land to be able to speak to her. The little mermaid became dearer and dearer to the prince every day. But he only looked upon her as a sweet, gentle child, and the thought of making her his wife never entered his head. And yet his wife she must be, before she could receive an immortal soul. His wife she must be, or she would change into foam and be driven restlessly over the billows of the sea. "Do you not love me above all others?" her eyes seemed to ask as he pressed her fondly in his arms and kissed her lovely brow. "Yes," the prince would say, "you are more dear to me than any other, for no one is as good as you are. You love me so much, and you are so like a young girl whom I saw once and may never see again. I was on board a ship which was wrecked by a sudden tempest. The waves threw me on the shore near a holy temple, where a number of young girls are occupied constantly with religious services. The youngest of them found me on the shore and saved my life. I only saw her once, but her alone can I love. But she belongs to the holy temple, and you, who resemble her so much, have been given to me for consolation. Never will we be parted." "Alas, he doesn't know that it was I who saved his life," thought the little mermaid, sighing deeply. "He said that the young girl belongs to the holy temple. She never comes out into the world, so they cannot meet each other again. And I am always with him. I will love him and devote my whole life to him." "So the prince is going to be married to the beautiful daughter of the neighboring king," said the courtiers. "That's why he's having that splendid ship fitted out. It's announced that he wishes to travel, but really he goes to see the princess. A numerous retinue will accompany him." The little mermaid smiled at these and similar conjectures, for she knew the prince's intentions better than anyone else. "I must go," he said to her. "I must see the beautiful princess. My parents require me to do so, but they will not compel me to marry her. And it's quite impossible for me to love her, for she can't be so like the beautiful girl in the temple as you are. And if I were obliged to choose, I should prefer you, my little silent foundling with the speaking eyes." "You're not afraid of the sea, are you, my sweet silent child?" he asked tenderly, as they stood together in the splendid ship which was to take them to the country of the neighboring king. And then he told her of the storms that sometimes stir the waters, of the strange fishes that inhabit the deep, and of the wonderful things seen by divers. But she smiled at his words, for she knew better than any child of earth what went on in the depths of the ocean. The next morning the ship entered the harbour of the king's capital. Bells were rung, trumpets sounded, and soldiers marched in procession through the city with waving banners. Soon the princess arrived. The little mermaid had been anxious to see this wonderful princess, and she was now obliged to confess that she'd never before seen so beautiful a creature. The skin of the princess was white and delicate, and her dark eyes sparkled beneath a pair of finely formed eyebrows. "It is herself," exclaimed the prince when they met. "It is she who saved my life when I lay like a corpse on the seashore. Oh, how happy I am," said he to his dumb foundling. "What I never dared to hope for has come to pass. You must rejoice in my happiness, for you love me more than all others who surround me."
It seemed to the mermaid as if her heart was breaking already, although the morning of his marriage day, which would see her death, had not yet dawned. Again the church bells rang, while heralds rode through the streets of the capital to announce the approaching marriage. Flames burned in silver candlesticks on all the altars, and bride and bridegroom joined hands while the holy words that united them were spoken. The little mermaid, dressed in silk and cloth of gold, stood behind the princess and held the train of the bridal dress. But her ear heard nothing of the solemn music. Her eyes saw not the holy ceremony. She remembered her approaching end. She remembered that she had lost both this world and the next. That evening, bride and bridegroom went on board the ship. Guns were fired in salute, flags waved in the breeze, and in the centre of the deck stood a magnificent pavilion of cloth of gold, fitted with the richest and softest couches. Here the princely pair were to spend the night. A wind swelled the sails, and the ship glided lightly over the blue waters. As soon as it was dark, coloured lamps were hung out, and dancing began on the deck. The little mermaid was reminded of what she'd seen the first time she rose to the upper world. This sight was equally splendid, and she was obliged to join in the dance, hovering lightly as a bird. Everyone applauded her, for never had she danced with more enchanting grace. Her little feet suffered extremely, but she no longer felt the pain. The anguish her heart suffered was much greater. It was the last evening she might see him for whose sake she had forsaken her home and all her family, had given away her beautiful voice, and suffered daily the most violent pain, all without his having the least suspicion of it. It was the last evening that she might breathe the same atmosphere in which he, the beloved one, lived. An eternal night, in which she might neither think nor dream, awaited her. And all was joy in the ship, and she, her heart filled with thoughts of death, smiled and danced with the others till past midnight. Then the prince kissed his lovely bride, and arm in arm they entered the magnificent tent prepared for them. All was now still. The steersman alone stood at the ship's helm. The little mermaid leaned her white arms on the gallery and looked towards the east, watching for the dawn. She well knew that the first sunbeam would witness her death. She saw her sisters rise out of the sea. Their features were deadly pale, and their long hair no more fluttered over their shoulders. It had all been cut off. "We have given it to the witch," they said, "to induce her to help you, so that you may not die. She has given us a knife. Here it is. Before the sun rises, you must plunge it into the prince's heart, and when his warm blood trickles down upon your feet, they will again be changed to a fish-tail. You will once more become a mermaid, and will live your full 300 years before you change to foam on the sea. But hasten! Either he or you must die before sunrise."
At these words they sighed deeply and vanished. The little mermaid drew aside the purple curtains of the pavilion, where the bride and bridegroom lay. Bending over them, she kissed the prince's forehead, and then, glancing at the sky, she saw the dawning light become every moment brighter. The prince's lips murmured the name of his bride. He was dreaming of her, while the fatal knife trembled in the hand of the unhappy mermaid. All at once she threw far out into the sea that instrument of death. The waves rose like bright blazing flames, and the water where it fell seemed tinged with blood. With eyes fast becoming dim and fixed, she looked once more at her beloved prince, then plunged from the ship into the sea, and felt her body slowly but surely dissolving into foam. The sun rose from its watery bed, and its beams fell so softly and warmly upon her that the little mermaid was scarcely sensible of dying. She still saw the glorious sun. She could still distinguish the white sails of the ship and the bright red clouds in the sky. The voices of airy creatures above her had a melody so sweet and soothing that a human ear would be as little able to catch the sounds as her eye was capable of distinguishing their forms. They hovered round her without wings, borne by their own lightness through the air. The little mermaid at last saw that she had a body as transparent as theirs, and felt herself raised gradually from the foam of the sea to higher regions. "Where are they taking me?" she asked, and her words sounded just like the voices of those heavenly beings. "You speak to the daughters of air. The mermaid has no immortal soul, and can only acquire that heavenly gift by winning the love of one of the sons of men. Her immortality depends upon union with man. Neither do the daughters of air possess immortal souls, but they can acquire them by their own good deeds. We fly to hot countries where the children of earth sink under sultry pestilential breezes. Our fresh, cooling breath revives them. We diffuse ourselves through the atmosphere. We perfume it with the delicious fragrance of flowers, and thus spread delight and health over the earth. By doing good in this manner for 300 years, we win immortality, and receive a share of the eternal bliss of human beings. And you, poor little mermaid, who, following the impulse of your own heart, have done and suffered so much, you are now raised to the airy world of spirits, that by performing deeds of kindness for 300 years, you may acquire an immortal soul." The little mermaid stretched out her transparent arms to the sun, and for the first time in her life, tears came to her eyes. She saw the prince with his pretty bride. Unseen, she kissed the bridegroom's forehead, smiled upon him, and then, with the rest of the children of air, soared high above the rosy cloud which was sailing so peacefully over the ship.